Greetings everyone. Our webinar will begin shortly. Hello everyone. I'm Kevin Morris with the Federal Aviation Administration and your host for our summer webinar series on operational waivers for unmanned aircraft systems. This is episode 8 of 9, and today we will be talking about operating limitations, in particular altitude. So you want to fly your drone higher than 400 feet. What is the process for that? A few notes as always before we get started here. With Adobe Connect, your audio is going to be through your speakers. We'll have a live Q&A session at the end, and at the bottom of the screen you'll see the question and answer pod, which will be available throughout the presentation for you to ask questions. And as our usual group of people in the production room, we have air traffic specialists, waiver team specialists, legal support specialists, flight standards specialists. So any question that you may have related to unmanned aircraft systems flying under Part 107, you may ask. Today specifically, though, we'll be focusing on operational waivers. As always, our session is being recorded, and we will post the recording as soon as possible up on our website, which will provide you with the address a little bit later on in our presentation. So what are our goals today? Well, if you've been following our summer webinar series, you know that we're trying to help you folks understand the requirements for obtaining a waiver. And today we're going to talk about operating at higher altitudes. Specifically, what type of risks may you encounter if you're operating at altitudes greater than 400 feet above ground level? We want to help you understand what we as the FAA need in your waiver application for those types of operations. And as usual, we'll go through the waiver safety explanation guidelines step by step so you folks have a good understanding of why we're asking the question and what the question really means to help you give us the answer that we really need to see. So let's start kind of at the beginning with this, operating limitations. When we're talking about flying at higher altitudes, we're really talking about Part 107.51. That's titled Operating Limitations. It includes things such as weather requirements, airspeed restrictions, and so on and so forth. But it also talks about the maximum altitudes you may operate your drone under Part 107. We all know that the maximum altitude under Part 107 is 400 feet above ground level. Now, there is a carve-out in that rule, so to speak, that if you want to fly higher than 400 feet, you may do so as long as you remain within a 400-foot radius of a structure and fly no higher than 400 feet above the uppermost limit of that structure. Very important to remember, whether you're talking about this part of the rule that allows you to fly higher than 400 feet, or you're talking about the waiver process, which we're about to discuss, none of these constitute an airspace authorization. Meaning that if you're going to fly and use the structure part of the rule to go higher than 400 feet, you need to make sure that the airspace that you're operating in, that you're flying into from below, you have authorization to be there. The same with the altitude waiver we're going to talk about. Just because you receive a waiver doesn't mean that you get to fly in any class airspace. You're still required, as you're going to see here in the next slide, to comply with certain particular rules of Part 107. And I've outlined just a few of them here for you to look at. If you receive an altitude waiver from the FAA to operate higher than 400 feet, it's important to remember that you still must comply with things like making sure your UAS isn't within visual line of sight, making sure that you can give way to other aircraft entering the area, that you don't fly over people. I just talked about operating in certain airspace, and I want to emphasize that point again. Just because you have an altitude waiver doesn't mean that you have airspace authorization to be in a class Bravo, Charlie, or Delta, or Echo surface airspace. You need to know what airspace. And in particular, weather also becomes more important as you're operating at higher altitudes because you're going to be closer to where a lot of the weather is generated in the atmosphere. So under Part 107.200, which gives us our list of rules that the FAA can provide waivers for, we may issue you a waiver for operating limitations altitude. It's up to the applicant, that's you folks out there, to provide us with a complete description of your proposed operation and include in that complete description a justification that the operation can safely be conducted. Those are key points because a lot of the things that you're going to find when operating at higher altitudes is these risks that you're seeing on your screen now. There are a lot of risks for operating at high altitude, but we're going to take a look at just the three here for our presentation today. Airspace, mentioned it twice already, going to mention it again. The airspace may change in which you're operating in. You may go from Class G to Class E. You may go from Class G to Class Bravo airspace. It really depends on where you're flying. avoiding aircraft becomes more of a challenge, or I should say more of a risk when you're operating at higher altitudes. Because typically speaking, operating at 400 feet or lower, you're really limiting the type of aircraft you may be exposed to. Maybe some helicopter operations, certainly, or aerial applicators, or what we call crop dusters, certainly operate at those types of altitudes. But now we're going up higher than 400 feet. So we're introducing new operational environment, different aircraft, different challenges. And finally, one of the topics we're going to discuss here in terms of risk is air traffic control. When you're flying at higher altitudes, you are going to need to be much more in contact with air traffic control and understand what they're doing so they can understand what you're doing as you're operating in their airspace. So let's detail these risks a little bit. Let's talk about airspace first. When you're submitting an application for an operating altitude waiver, knowing what airspace you're going to operate in is critical. You have to have a very solid understanding of all the airspace in your area and that you may be operating in. For example, maybe it's not just Class Bravo or Class Charlie that you may enter, but maybe there are some Victor airways in that area that you're flying in. So Victor airways are kind of like highways in the sky, very commonly flown routes. Are those in your area? Do you have military training routes in your area, which a lot of times can be low-level flight activity? That's very important to know. I touched on it before, but just because you're up in the air higher doesn't mean that you have the right to fly over people. You still have to comply with the rules. So how are you going to avoid flying over people on the ground when you're up at the higher altitudes? So to give an example of what I'm talking about in terms of airspace and the complexities that you might encounter and the risks, how they increase, let's take a look at this theoretical operation of a UAS. I've circled where the UAS is on the screen, and that is my proposed area of operation. And let's say I want to fly my UAS at 1,000 feet above ground level. No, I'm not near any structure, so I need a waiver to do this. There are quite a few things just in that one spot that I intend to fly that I need to be concerned with and address in my waiver application. One of them we mentioned already, Victor Airways. That's the arrow pointing to that blue line that runs almost top to bottom on the screen, and is Victor 563. That is an airway in the sky that's commonly flown by traffic, and I'm going to be very near that airway when I intend to operate. So how frequently do aircraft travel on that airway? How low do aircraft operate on that airway? I need to know. The other one, the arrow on the left side of the screen, is pointing to a military training route. And that military training route goes right through my intended area of operation. Do I know who's flying that military training route? Do I know how high the aircraft are? Do I know if they're going to be VFR or IFR, meaning visual flight rules or instrument flight rules aircraft? All those numbers, IR 180, would tell me that information. Just south of where I'm flying is a huge wind farm. Now that's not necessarily an airspace or altitude type issue, but I can promise you that if you have a strong wind out of the south for this proposed operation, that is something you're going to want to have to consider, because the amount of turbulence generated from wind farm can reach 500 to 600 feet above the top of the wind turbines. Most wind turbines top out around 400 to 500 feet. So now you're talking about turbulence areas 500 to maybe 1,000 feet AGL in that area. How about the airspace itself? I'm operating maybe within the Lancer military operations area. Is that operations area effective? Is it on standby right now? What is the floor of that airspace? What is the ceiling? What type of operations are being conducted in there? Who's the controlling agency? Who do I need to contact to coordinate my operations with? There's also a couple airports on the screen, but I highlighted one in particular because if you look at that airport layout, it looks like they have a runway that sort of points directly towards where I intend to fly my UAS. Do I have to worry about traffic coming into that airport along my route of flight? How high I'm going to fly is really going to depend on how much I need to worry about that airport traffic. So this is just one example of having to know the airspace and the activities around your intended area of operation in order to include that in your waiver application. So let's go right to avoiding aircraft. This becomes, as I mentioned earlier, slightly more challenging as we're operating at higher altitude. You need to know what type of aircraft you're going to be underneath, and you need to know how often those aircraft are going to come by. So who are you sharing the sky with, and how frequently are those aircraft going to come through your area of operation? These are things you need to do some research on to understand and include those mitigations in your application. How are you going to know when another aircraft enters your area? Are you going to use a visual observer, or 2 visual, or 3 visual observers to try to find other aircraft? How do those visual observers alert you to that aircraft, and how are you going to yield right of way? We've heard me say it a few different times, where it's the what and the how of a waiver application. So what you're doing is just as important as how you're going to do that. So make sure when you're submitting your application, you're including the how. How are you going to avoid other aircraft? How will you know when they're there? Very, very important. The last point I want to bring up here before I move into our waiver safety explanation guidelines is air traffic control. So you need to understand which facility is controlling the airspace you intend to operate in. If it's Class E or Bravo or Delta airspace, you need to know who is going to be in control of that airspace. What type of coordination will be needed between yourself as the remote pilot in command and the air traffic controller. Remember, the primary job of an air traffic controller is to ensure separation of aircraft. And I've yet to meet one air traffic controller that enjoys having aircraft in their airspace that they cannot see on radar. So the type of coordination you're going to have to do is very extensive and important to air traffic control, as they're working aircraft in the airspace you're flying in and they can't see you. So when are you going to start, when are you going to finish, how high are you going to fly, all that's very, very critical. So we're ready to start our application. We want to fly higher than 400 feet. I know what my risks are. Where do I start? Where we always start, right? The waiver safety explanation guidelines. That is our key first step in any waiver application. And it's very, very important because it's going to help you address some of our primary concerns, which are: how will you ensure your operation remains safe at all times? What type of circumstances could develop? And if they're unusual, how are you going to handle that? Again, tell us what's going to happen and how you're going to do that. Very key in the waiver safety explanation guidelines. It's also important to note, as always, the list of questions in the WSEG, the waiver safety explanation guidelines, are not all inclusive. You may need to, and in terms of altitude operating waiver, you probably will have to include additional information, perhaps about your unmanned aircraft, how you're going to operate, the types of communications available. Very critical to your application. So let's get into the waiver safety explanation and guidance here for operating altitude. There are 5 key points that we want you to address at minimum in your waiver application. And they deal with what we kind of talked about already, some of the risks, right? Avoiding other aircraft, ensuring that your unmanned aircraft can be seen for at least 3 miles, making sure that the remote pilot command knows the altitude, attitude, and direction of flight at all times. Key to this is describing your area of operations. Again, the operating altitude waivers we're going to see here is very dependent on where you're flying and what airspace you're going to be in. And finally, we'll round out with our air traffic control communications, which is the last critical piece in our waiver safety explanation guidelines. So WSEG question number 1 deals with describing how the remote pilot in command is going to be able to avoid other aircraft or structures during flight. So when we fly higher than 400 feet, whether that's 800 or 1,000 or maybe 1,500 feet, it becomes more difficult to see our unmanned aircraft. And it gets a little bit tougher to figure out if we're going to be above or below or on a collision course with another aircraft. I've been flying aircraft for many, many years. I know many, many people that fly aircraft for many years. We all think we can determine cloud heights. Like, how high is that cloud? Oh, I'll look at it and kind of determine. Or when we're flying an aircraft, mine a collision course, the reality is it's very difficult to judge. And so that is the same for unmanned aircraft operating at higher altitudes. Another thing that we see in some of our applications, and I'll bring this up again here in a little bit, is that some of the applications request altitudes that would put the unmanned aircraft outside of the visual line of sight. And that's not going to work. Remember, you have to be in compliance with other parts of the rule, even though you have an altitude waiver. It doesn't waive or deviate any of those other rules for you. You still must operate within visual line of sight. So speaking of sight, how are we going to make sure that the unmanned aircraft can be seen for at least 3 miles? Now, we've seen this pop up before. This has come up in the daylight waiver. It came up in episode 7, which was our beyond visual line of sight waiver. But ensuring that our unmanned aircraft can be seen for at least 3 statute miles is important. Not because you need to be able to see the lights on it, but that other aircraft or non-participating aircraft may see that vehicle for at least 3 miles. Different than the night. Now, during the day, it's more difficult to see aircraft lighting because there's simply less contrast. At night, you've got usually a black sky and a bright white, green, red light, what have you, on the aircraft. It can be fairly easy to spot. That same light with that same intensity during the daytime is much more difficult to see. So what lights you had on your UAS that worked great for night may not work great for day. So how are you going to make sure that the aircraft can be seen for at least 3 miles away? If you're going to state in your application, hey, they don't need to see my unmanned aircraft for at least 3 miles, you need to let us know why as well. And it's typically because you're in something that's restricted airspace, or you're operating in a temporary flight restriction, or other aircraft will be purposely excluded from where you are flying. Now, one of the criteria for the remote piloting command in any operation that are flying under Part 107 is that they always know the UA's geographic location, the altitude, the attitude, and direction of flight. And remember, this has to be obtained within visual line of sight. So as we go up in altitude, this becomes more difficult to pick out these types of information. And if you add in like a slow moving cloud layer, or maybe even a fast moving cloud layer, if you're staring straight up at your UAS for a while, that may give you a false sense of movement. You start to get a little bit of a vertigo where the aircraft appears to be moving simply because the background is moving on it. So that's something you need to be concerned with and address in your application. Now, a lot of people will put in telemetry. I'm using telemetry, which is great supporting data. But remember, we have to be able to determine this visually as well. And if you're going to use telemetry as a data source, what happens when that telemetry goes away? What happens if you have a data failure when you're not getting the altitude back through your command control station? What are you going to do if that information no longer exists? How are you going to handle that? So I've talked about this before, but maintaining visual line of sight is critical. And the reason I'm bringing it up again is because it tends to get lost a little bit in this application, because we start talking about altitude and I need to go up to 5,000 feet or 3,000 feet to get this particular mission completed. And we don't think about the fact that, you know what, if I can't see my UAS horizontally because of its size, say it's a smaller UAS at 800 feet away, I'm still not going to be able to see it vertically at 800 feet. So a lot of applications that we get will say, I want to fly my UAS at 3,000 feet. Well, realistically, are you going to be able to see your UAS a half mile away? It would depend on the size. It would depend on the configuration, certainly. But if you're just using a tiny light on it to determine where it is, that's probably not going to give you information like the attitude, the direction of flight. So this information is critical when you're supplying your risk mitigations. Don't submit an altitude waiver that puts your aircraft beyond visual line of sight unless you're also going to submit a beyond visual line of sight waiver application along with it, which is totally up to you. That's something you may do. So we get into the last couple WSEGs here, and we start to drill down a little bit more to the air traffic side. The altitude waiver is the first one that we've really talked about in this series here, our summer webinar series, where it's about a 50-50 review process. So Flight Standards, the group that I work in, we are in charge of evaluating your safety case, your justification, your risk mitigations, things like that, to make sure that what you're doing and how you're doing it with the UAS ensures safety of the national airspace system. The other half of the coin is air traffic. They're responsible for the airspace. They're responsible, again, for that separation of traffic. And they need to make sure that where you're operating, very specifically where you're operating in terms of latitude, longitude, maybe a radius around a point, the maximum altitude that you're proposing is detailed in with sectional charts. I'm going to show you a couple links later on that gives you some information that you can use to submit with your application. But they need to know, because if they don't have all that specific detailed information in your waiver application in terms of where you're flying and how high you want to go, they cannot make their safety case review of your application, and it would most likely be either denied or they would delay it with a request for more information. So be detailed as possible, because these folks are working that airspace. So the last WSEG is air traffic. What communications equipment are you going to use to keep your lines of communication open to air traffic control if need be? Is that communication equipment you're using, is it reliable? Is it authorized? If you're transmitting on a frequency, are you authorized to transmit on that frequency? Do you have a backup system if your main system fails? Or you end up in an area where you thought your cell phone would get a signal and now it doesn't. Well, if air traffic only has a cell number to get a hold of you and now your phone is no service, how are they going to get a hold of you? That's something that you really need to think about ahead of time. Another thing I added in here is in terms of getting a contact call from air traffic control, who's going to answer that? Let's say you're using a phone. Who's going to answer the phone? If the remote pilot in command is operating the aircraft and they're the person manipulating controls, their primary job should be flying that aircraft. So maybe you're going to have somebody in your operations crew be the one that monitors the phone and monitors the communication. Regardless of who answers that phone, air traffic needs to have a relatively direct link to the remote pilot in command. So don't have that person answering the phone 200 feet away from you. Have that person right next to you. Again, it's something you need to consider, and these are going to be very operationally specific situations. Only you know your operation best, and so you are the best source of information to us about how your operation is going to work, and in particular with communicating with air traffic control. So, top 3 takeaways from this one here on operating altitude. Know your airspace. That is probably one of the most critical components to this application. You absolutely have to know where you're flying and what airspace you're flying in. Also maintain visual line of sight. Make sure that when you're submitting your application, you're not putting in maximum flight planned altitudes that will put you beyond visual line of sight. And if you've determined that you can go to 1,000 feet or 1,200 feet with your UAS and still maintain visual line of sight, include that determination. How did you determine that in your application? Because otherwise we don't know. Again, you're the expert on your operation. And make sure that you're including your risk mitigations for the operation. That's how the waiver safety explanation guidelines work. That's what they steer you towards, and that's what we want to get from you. So wrapping up here, we have our usual bits of information about where you can get more help. Our FAA UAS website is a great one-stop shop for all your UAS needs. The drone zone documents is where you're going to find the waiver safety explanation guidelines, your waiver application instructions. It's also where you actually will apply for your altitude waiver. Our waiver series website, I mentioned this at the very beginning, we have all of our previously recorded episodes up on our website, as well as all the questions that you folks have been submitting into the Q&A pod for this episode and the previous 7 episodes all get answered and they all get posted onto our website, as well as documents that we reference throughout these episodes. Those are also located on that website. So you can find everything there, watch all the previous versions on that. I added this one in here at the end because this is very specific when we talked about sectional charts and VFR charts and airspace charts, whatever you'd like to call them. We have resources available to you on that website you see on the screen now for free. You can download them. You can download different versions of them. The website down there at the bottom, it's a bit of a mouthful, but the good news is the last slide here, after we get through the live Q&A, when we get to the goodbye slide, I'll put the web links back up, and that is one of the web links you'll see on there to get access to the charts, whether you want them TIFF or geospatial or metadata raster charts, whatever you want to call them. All that information will be there at the very end of the program. So that wraps up our informational content here today. But again, don't go anywhere because we're going to take a short break and we're going to get into the live Q&A. I'd like to mention too that during this time, the Q&A pod where you can type in your questions will remain active at the bottom of your screen. Our production crew of excellent UAS experts have been working hard to answer your questions here today. If you don't get your question answered today, no worries. We will eventually get to it. It just means that your question was a little bit more nuanced and we want to do a little bit of research on our end. But like I said, everything is posted to the website. So thank you for your attention today. Please stick around. We're just going to take a short break and then get into the live Q&A session here. So thank you, and I'll be back shortly.